Thank you very much, Charles. And first, I want to thank all of you for attending the event today. It's a real privilege to be able to talk to you and share some stories about Guyana and help you to understand it. But first, I should tell you some things about myself, and hopefully, that will give you a flavor and a bit of context about Guyana. So, my name is Neil Marks. As you can tell, I am Indian, but Neil Marks is by no means an Indian name. My name Neil. I know this because I like to check these things out. My name Neil, it has its origin in the Celtic region, so just nearby here, and it means champion. So I hope that counts for something. Um, my last name Marks was not supposed to be Marks actually. It was supposed to be Rupdial because of my Indian ancestry, but apparently back in the colonial days, it was more profitable to have an English name in order to get work and to get into school. And so my paternal grandfather changed my father's name to Marks. And so when he married mom, all of us came along. And so that's how my last name is Marks. So, for those of you who may not know, half of Guyana looks like me. That's because back in the mid 19th century, when slavery was abolished, there was a shortage of labor on the sugar plantations. And so the Indian subcontinent was thought to be the avenue for substitute workers. And so tens of thousands of Indians were brought to Guyana between 1838 and 1917, and they included my ancestors. So the other half of Guyana, well, mostly half of it is made up of descendants of the freed African slaves. There are some Chinese, some Europeans and Portuguese, and we have nine Amerindian nations. So 9 nations of indigenous peoples. Many of them still speak their native languages. Now, in the early days of its history, it seemed that everyone wanted a piece of Guyana, but was mostly European nations. From 1796, it was mostly the British and the French which juggled for control of Guyana. But eventually, Britain consolidated power, and so in 1831, it became British Guyana. Now, Guyana gained independence from Britain in May 26, 1966. So if you check in the dates, you would see that tomorrow is actually Guyana's independence anniversary. Now, 4 years after independence, Guyana decided to shed all links that it had to Britain, and it became a republic. That was in 1970. 10 years later, that's when I was born in 1980. I mention it because that is the year that Guyana established its own constitution, and we had our first executive president. 1980, coincidentally, was the year that the first television appeared in Guyana. And so that's of interest to me, obviously, because I work in TV at the moment. So in 1980, the man who came to power was a man called Forbes Burnham. He was an attorney. He was largely put into power because of the machinations of the British and the US government, because the most popular leader at the time, Dr. Chedi Jagan, who had won the elections prior to independence, Britain and the US feared that another communist nation was developing in the Western Hemisphere apart from Cuba. And so they decided to stop that. And through a number of means, they basically facilitated Burnham coming into power. So he was actually the prime minister in 1966 when we gained independence. And when the Constitution was introduced in 1980, he became our first executive president. Burnham uh, largely stayed in power because of rigged elections. He rigged those elections with the support of the army at the time. But Burnham died in 1985, and in 1992, because of international pressure, the involvement of Jimmy Carter, the former US president, led to free and fair elections. And so we had the first free and fair elections in Guyana after independence in 1992. 1992. And so Dr. Chadi Jagan, the popular leader I referred to earlier, he became president, but he was not able to live out a complete term. He died shortly before his first term in office ended. When he died, his widow, Mrs. Janet Jagan, became the president of Guyana. For those of you who don't know, Mrs. Jagan was a Jewish American woman from Chicago. And so there was actually an American woman who became president. And that was in Guyana. Janet Jagan is a personality that I've looked at a lot, and she was once referred to by Time magazine as one of history's most rebellious women. Very fascinating story about her. But she only stayed in office for 2 years, and she resigned because of ill health. And that led us to have Dr. Bharat Jagdeo as president in 1999, and he served, I think, the longest as president, the longest president in office Guyana has ever had. Dr. Jagdeo was trained as an economist in Moscow, Russia. So he speaks Russian, and we've had very good relations with Russia. Um, it was surprising to me as a journalist, knowing the position that Guyana has, the relations with Russia that Guyana has had, that when Russia invaded Ukraine, that Guyana came out with a very strong political statement against Russia and back in Ukraine. That was very surprising to me. But Dr. Jagdeo is now the vice president of Guyana. I should back up and tell you that in 2011, office, when he left office is when the PPP, the party that came into power in 1992, they lost the seat of government. So things started to get a bit nasty in Guyana at that point, because that was the first time in our history that we had a minority government. The PPP remained in power. Uh, in 2015 was perhaps the most exciting time in Guyana on the political front, because there was a lot of agitation at the time for change. The PPP has admitted as much that it made mistakes in not connecting with its base, and so it lost power. But it was exciting because it was for the first time a multi-party coalition came together, and uh, people were happy to see that, because throughout Guyana's history, post-independence, at least, we've always had ethnic politics in Guyana. So if you look like me, you would end up voting almost certainly for the PPP, and if you were black, then you end up voting for the PNC. But in 2015, a group of parties came together, and it was really exciting to see young professional Indians joining with a predominantly black party against the PPP. And so that coalition came to power in 2015 on the former Army brigadier, David Granger. Coincidentally, he was a general during Burnham's time, and he was accused of being part of those rigged elections. So when he came to power, there was a lot of excitement. But that was short-lived, because that party did not achieve much. I can't tell you of something of note that they've done that I could put my finger on and to say, this is the legacy of that coalition, or the legacy of Guringer. So 3.5 years after he came to power, the government was deposed through a no confidence motion in the National Assembly. It was brought by Dr. Jagdeo. It passed because one member of the government side of the House defected and voted with the opposition. The elections should have been held in 3 months, but Granger held on to power because his party and agents challenged the votes in the National Assembly, the legitimacy of the no confidence vote, and the voting of their member on this motion. And so that dragged on for quite a long time, I believe around about 13 months before we were able to get elections. So things at that time were very tense because the international community at the time had deemed the government unconstitutional, and a lot of funding, which we depend on development aid and funding for large projects, were stalled. So in March 2020, we had the elections. It was very clear that the coalition at the time could not win another elections because of the policies that they had pursued. I think one of the most scandalous ones was the closure of four sugar estates, leaving the country with just three. The closure of those estates sent about 7,000 people home. So you can calculate 7,000 workers multiplied by three or four and their families. And you could just imagine the impact in a country like Guyana with just with less than 750,000 people. And the sugar base really is the PPP's. Their base, they are Indian voters. And so that led to the collapse of the coalition. When the party lost the elections, it was very clear 2 days after the elections that they had lost, but they were determined to hold on to power. So through a number of I would say excursions, legal excursions. They remained in power for 5 months. It was the longest elections any democracy had ever seen, um, at least any democracy with less than 1 million people. And so those elections dragged on for 5 months, and eventually, on August 2nd, I believe, in 2020, Dr. Irfan Ali, who was a former Minister of Housing, he came to power under the PPP. So that's just a little bit background about the political evolution in Guyana and where the country is at the moment. Uh, the PPP is in power, but it is in power by just a one-seat majority in the National Assembly. If you know anything about politics in Guyana, that one-seat majority counts for a lot, even though the last government lost power by that one seat. Um, but it means essentially that if you are in the legislature with a one-seat majority or any majority at all, you basically get your way. There is no lower upper house in Guyana's parliament. And so the government controls the business in the National Assembly. So whatever laws, regulations it takes to parliament, it is guaranteed to be passed, especially since there is a sympathetic member of the opposition um, with the government. This is a three-party coalition that joined their votes together, and they won a seat in the National Assembly. They're very sympathetic to the PPP. In fact, the member of parliament who sits right now is a aviation advisor to the government. So we see where that is going. So essentially, people say the PPP has a two-seat majority. But in any case, the point I was making is that whatever the ruling party or the government takes to the parliament, it is guaranteed to be passed in the house. So some quick things now about Guyana. We're on mainland South America, so we're not an island like many people confuse us to be. So we're not in the Caribbean. We're on mainland South America. We have Venezuela to the west, Suriname to the east, and there's Brazil to the south. So we're right at the top, the northern top there of South America. Um, we do not have the blue water and sandy beaches of the Caribbean, but historically we have been tied to the Caribbean economically, socially, and so on. Like all of our music and everything, we identify with the Caribbean. Nothing of South America. We don't speak Spanish. We don't speak Portuguese, even though we have the giant Brazil right next door. Some Spanish and Portuguese is taught in school, but not to a great degree. So you may have pockets of people who speak Spanish and Portuguese, but not a lot. Um, so by virtue of British colonization, English is taught in schools. We speak English, though most of us speak what I consider our native tongue, which is Creole, and it depends on which part of the country you are from. The Creole would vary. So, being Indian, I speak Indo-Guyanese Creole, so it's a kind of a mixture of English and Bhojpuri language, which the Indians brought with them during the time of Indian indentureship. Our land area is the size of England, 83,000 square miles, and we have 85% of it covered in rainforest. If you take a plane ride across the rainforest, it looks like a massive giant broccoli field with black waters snaking through. And yes, we have black waters. That's the waters that historically we've used for cooking, washing, and doing everything. Basically, Guyana is known as the land of many waters. So we have tons of rivers and creeks and all of that. Now, the coast is where most Guyanese live. It's just like a tiny strip of land facing the Atlantic. So that's where all economic activity takes place. So you have mainly agriculture, rice, sugar. That's where the seat of government is. But the problem with the coast is that it is below sea level. And so oftentimes we're in this very tricky situation of facing a rising sea and waters coming down from the mountains. So where people live is essentially sort of like a basin. So we do have the Dutch developed an elaborate system of canals and so on to drain the land, but it becomes difficult if there's a high tide. So we have what you call cokers and sluices that lets the water out, but if there's a high tide, you can't get the water out. And we don't have a great amount of pumps so that you can pump the water over the seawall. So throughout the coast, you have concrete walls, which kind of serves as a barricade. From the ocean, but it's not always effective. So I would say the one major problem that we have in Guyana is flooding, and that problem has not been resolved. For the first time in our history, this current government is talking about reorienting the drainage and irrigation system, the entire system, so that it can now take on the challenges of climate change. Because traditionally we had two rainy seasons, December, January, and May, June, but now we're having more intense periods of rainfall, and it's happening more than it did before. So there's an absolute need to readjust our drainage and irrigation system. Now, Guyana is divided into 10 administrative regions. The ideal situation is that they should govern themselves, but that's not the case. The leaders of the 10 administrative regions are also elected at elections. And it's basically, you're not voting for the leaders, you're voting for the party. And once elections are over, whoever wins the elections, that party selects its leaders in the different regions. And so they're largely controlled by central government. The regions that don't win the support of the party in power, sometimes the relationship is very, very toxic. So the oil and gas sector is, of course, what is being talked about before. I mentioned to Charles just before this talk started that I think people are literally falling over themselves to get into Guyana because oil and gas took us by storm, you can say, because the first discovery was in May 2015, and just about 5 years we started production. It was kind of fascinating, frightening, exciting all at the same time because I don't believe that there's a country that has moved so quickly from discovery to production. And at this point in time, ExxonMobil has made 31 discoveries. I think they announced three new ones last month. And so it's very fascinating what is happening in the country at the moment. It is estimated that ExxonMobil and its partners, Hess and CNOOC, but Exxon obviously being the operator, they will be pumping something about, let me say, I do have a note, at 1.2 million barrels of oil and gas per day from the giant Stabroek block that they control by 2027. 1.2 million barrels a day in a country with less than 750,000 people. I think they say I haven't actually checked this out myself, but per capita, we will be producing more than Kuwait in the very near future by 2027, 2025, even. So, since the production began, like I said, in 2019, December, all of the proceeds were put into an account at uh, the US Federal Reserve Bank in New York. None of it was used in the initial 5 years, but This year is the first year that the government has started to spend the oil revenues, and by Guyanese standards, it is a massive amount of money because uh, through legislation that was passed last year, the government was able to take out 100%, so all of the revenues that was accumulated over the 5 years, and put it into this year's budget. And so that propped up the budget by 1/3 of what it was last year. So it's a massive amount of money. There are all sorts of infrastructure projects going on in Guyana. They're building roads, bridges. They've talked about 6 new regional hospitals. A massive, massive housing expansion going on in Guyana. So it's a very busy place, and there is, you know, uh, a really big room or rooms for investment in Guyana. One of the current government is really making a concerted effort to prove that Guyana will not fall prey to the Dutch disease. And so they have been investing in agriculture heavily, or at least they have plans to invest in agriculture heavily. Uh, like I mentioned at the outset, 4 of the sugar estates were closed by the last government. This government is trying to reopen them. How much economic sense that makes is yet to be seen, because we are producing sugar at more the price than you can actually sell it for at the moment. And the 3 estates that were left, they are largely supported by uh, uh, what do you call this now? Subsidies from the government, billions of dollars. So the government is trying to reopen the estates which were closed. One of the estates they will not reopen. It's at Wales on the west bank of Demerara. I know the geography may not make sense to most of you, but that is where it is planned to set up a natural gas power plant. ExxonMobil is working with the government on that. The government is very keen on it because one of the big problems in Guyana is electricity. It's very unreliable. I think it's the thing. I think we have the highest electricity rates in all of Latin America and the Caribbean. I, th- I think the reliability is more the concern over the cost for most Guyanese. Many manufacturers, like the biggest companies in Guyana, say for example those who bottle Coca-Cola and Pepsi, that they have moved into their own electricity generation. The first proper mall that the country had, they are generating their own power. There was a plan for them to sell some of it to the national grid, so to give the general population some of that power. So electricity is a big problem. One of the plans that the PPP government had before it lost power in 2015 was setting up a massive hydropower plant in the jungle and transmitting that power to the coast, but that project was vetoed by the opposition because they had control of the parliament at that time. That project, the Amira Falls Hydro project, is now back on the agenda, and the PPP is pursuing that very vigorously because it sees it as the answer to this problem that we have had with electricity. Now, I just did want to talk a bit about the investment sectors that are open, but I should let you know of the how diverse the land is in Guyana. So we have largely four different types of land. So, like I mentioned, we have the low coastal plain. That is where most agriculture happens: rice, sugar, cash crops, whatever. It all happens on the coast. But we also have the hilly sand and clay belt, which is just outside of the main population center. And then you have the Rupununi savannas, which is just vast expanse of land that is just sitting there, open land with not much forest. And then we have the Pacaraima Mountains. Back in the 70s, there was a massive experiment to plant onions and potatoes, but it never worked out because of transportation issues to get it from the mountains to markets in the city and elsewhere.
2 minutes. 2 minutes.
Sorry?
2 minutes.
Sure. So there are a number of sectors that are ripe for investment. So there's agriculture, there is tourism, uh, there is mining, there is manufacturing, and all of these areas for investments come with um, very generous incentives from the government because, like I say, they're really trying to show that Guyana can avoid the Dutch disease. So there's a lot of incentives for people to invest in Guyana. I'll give you an example. In agriculture, what the government has offered is very cheap land to some Caribbean nations, Trinidad and Barbados. So investors can get agricultural land at just $5 per acre on a 50-year lease. And then there are a host of tax concessions that you can get off of equipment and so on that are used in the manufacturing and production sectors. So I mean, I can leave it at there, and if there are anyone with questions, I can talk a little bit more about the avenues for investment and the incentives that are on offer. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much. Over to you, Neil.
Thank you very much. It's a pleasure to meet you all on screen. Neil, thanks for rolling the turf so beautifully. I'm not sure there's much left for me to say, even when it comes down to explaining the background of our mutual Celtic name. Look, in many ways, I really sort of can't touch a lot of what you provided such a sort of soft hands under the skin feel for. I'm hoping and assuming that on this call are a mix of those of you who are already present or active in Guyana in some fashion, and those of you who are contemplating a first trip or investing or touching there and perhaps have had your tails tweaked by the recent Guyanese president visit, on which he said if you're investing or looking at Guyana in 2022, you're already a little late. What I wanted to do, and I hope this is helpful in the context of this briefing, is really just share a few personal perspectives, having made a multitude of trips as an investor, as an advisor, and personally, to the extent I now have a lot of very good friends in Guyana over the last 6 years. I think if we can just flick the slides forward, great, and one more again, and again. So this is me. I'm the CEO of a mid-market investment bank in London called Hannam Partners. I first went to Guyana in 2016. Since then, I've raised money for a number of the oilfield service companies. I've invested probably slightly more money than I've actually told my wife about in agriculture, in real estate, and in oilfield services. And for good measure, I've taken my family and children down to what is the most beautiful and wonderful country on a few trips as well. If we just go forward a slide. So I thought this was an interesting place to start. Here's what the league tables tell us. Question whether, at least in sort of perception here, Guyana is going sort of down or others are going up. Guyana ranks sort of relatively lowly in ease of doing business rankings. It's sort of middle of a global leaderboard in corruption perceptions index, albeit I think correctly rising. If we go forward a slide, what I really wanted to do is try and share what I think that actually means and feels like in practical terms. Why am I continuing to spend so much time there? Why do I love the country? Why do I believe in it? So if we just go forward a slide. You've got a strong and very stable currency, modest appreciation over the last decade only. Many respects a currency pairing that I think would make many other places in the world, sort of plenty of European and sort of EU nations included, blush. If we go forward a slide. The country, for probably obvious reasons, has always been in a good position and is now in a fantastic position in terms of dollar reserves. They exist The country's not subject to currency restrictions. It's easy to get your money in. It's equally easy to get your money out. I think those of you who either know and understand raw dollars or know the oil and gas industry will appreciate these are staggering numbers from Exxon sort of standing start late 2020. We're going to be well in excess of 1 million barrels a day in the next 5 years. That's Exxon's estimate. And I think that continues to grow in terms of the number of offshore FPSO floating production and storage vessels being brought to bear, and the industry that's in support of that. If we just go forward a slide. That was a little on the financial. Just shifting to the governmental. This is myself and a couple of the team on our farm in the agriculture business, taking a government minister and one of the then UK TI members round our farm. Ghana doesn't have a big population. It's about 750,000. I think for both reasons associated with that and also just the sort of very good nature of a lot of sort of people there, government access is excellent. You can get to anyone you want very straightforwardly, and ministers at all levels are dynamic and energetic, all the more so this latest government, and keen to enable investment and corporate activity. If we just go forward a slide. The regulatory codes, court system, rule of law is strong, it's robust, it's independent. It's in terms of a well-functioning judiciary, a strong and independent media, as well as the formal sort of legislature and executive branches of government. You've got a system that anyone dialing into this call from the UK or any sort of developed market would recognise very well. It's transparent and it's clean. If there is a reason that I personally am pretty optimistic about the likelihood of sort of avoiding Dutch disease, it is this combination of a small, close a small, close knit community, transparency and visibility within the population, strong independent judiciary and strong independent media. I think that gives you all the ingredients you need in terms of checks and balances and institutions and individuals that therefore sort of can and will hold each other to account. If we just go forward a slide. There's stacks of excellent law firms. I'm not on sort of commission from any of these guys. They just happen to be 3 or 4 partners at 3 or 4 of the big firms I've worked with and have found excellent. You'll also note, such is the nature of sort of not only a strong University of Guyana, but overseas sort of education, Guyanese diaspora. I interestingly, for those who like sort of strong local lawyers, but who sort of qualified and practiced internationally, here are partners at a number of the sort of leading firms cast in their name with sort of strong sort of UK court or in pedigree as well. If we just go forward a slide. Look, I think back to our indices and back to the sort of questions and sort of paranoias that people have in any sort of emerging market. I didn't want to sort of leave discussion around kind of bribery and corruption in the shadows. My experience in Ghana is it's in evidence, but it's actually sectorally very confined and restricted. All of the Guyanas have a material illegal drugs trade. They're a kind of egress route out of continental South and Central America. Which is why you see sort of periodic UK and European naval patrols in the region. And to the extent that Guyana has a significant gold industry, inevitably it also has an artisanal gold industry, and it has a legal movement of gold, therefore. But what that also means, and I think this is incredibly positive for anyone sort of excited about looking at the country in the context of things other than gold and narcotics, is that it's remarkably easy and straightforward to sort of move, enact government support, get deals done and transact without there being any hint of an outstretched hand or sort of the request for or sort of nod to bribery at all. There's this kind of sectorally confined dirty money issue. Various kind of authorities and militaries turn their hand to that, outside of that, business is pretty straightforward, and certainly to my mind and experience, it's the issues on this side that, if you like, affect a country in sort of leaderboard terms, but they're not practically present day to day, week to week, or year to year at all. We just go forward a slide. Look, wonderfully smart people. As I said, I've got a farming business in Guyana that is sort of expanding domestically and in the region at the moment. We've got a country manager, we've got a number of farm managers. I've also got a sort of real estate investment company with 3 or 4 local partners. All of my partners and senior managers are Guyanese. Most of them are now very good friends. They're just extremely high quality people. I don't worry about getting my sort of audit signed off cleanly by BDO when the books run by those team members are being scrutinised, any more than I worry about sending a delegation of 3 or 4 people from the World Bank to tour a farm in the hands of our local team. We're genuinely talking sort of, very smart, well-educated, business savvy culture, commercially savvy culture. Also with this kind of massive rich pool of diaspora to draw on. There's far more Guyanese and CARICOM sort of nationals by one sort of generation of separation living internationally than there are in country in the region. And I think we're starting, for obvious reasons, to see the phenomenon of returning diaspora, which I also think is very positive. If we go forward a slide. Physical security. Yeah, I mean, I said, look, safe enough to take your family. You can go to the cinema, you can go to the Hard Rock Cafe, you can hang out by the hotel pool. As in all oil towns, take care if you're in the wrong bar after dark. My personal view is that is as true in Lagos as it is in Georgetown. It's also as true in Aberdeen or Houston as it is in Georgetown. Beyond that, I don't think one sees or experiences a material issue. Next slide. A lot of the coastal fringes of Guyana are at or near sea level. It's definitely a country that's going to have to think about water and the impact of water rather than its absence over coming years. Georgetown does flood, so too does Houston, so too do plenty of other oil towns. I think ultimately the country, which was sort of many parts British and Dutch settled, has for a long time been good at living at or near sea level and understanding what is needed in terms of drainage and dams and precautions to cope with that. And I think that continues to be in evidence in the infrastructure and is therefore ultimately manageable. We just go forward a slide. This perhaps slightly more a benefit for those looking at the oilfield service space, particularly something I actually drew up a couple of years ago, where there was an awful lot of sort of anecdotal frustration and grumbling being felt across the sort of energy sector about the quote unquote sort of lack of formal coordination going into establishing a single, centrally led or empowered oil field service centre. As Neil said, Guyana is literally a sort of land of many rivers. It looks likely that the offshore industry will be serviced not just from one single master location, but rather a variety of ports and service bases that are being invested in parallel in various kind of rivers and towns. The only point I'd make when you look at the kind of physical time to travel but between those locations, it doesn't feel terribly different to me sat in London from London as a world-class financial centre with 3 separate functioning sub-centres within it. As anyone who's tried to get a taxi from Mayfair to Canary Wharf will bear testament to, the journey time there is about the same as it is between any of the sort of hubs in Guyana. Again, I don't sort of see an issue there that in any way is going to constrain the offshore. Next slide. State balance sheet and indebtedness. Look, remarkably, I think through some fascinating combination of sort of apathy, probably even a bit of incompetence and some fiscal prudence, ultimately this current government inherited a wonderfully strong under-levered balance sheet as oil production started. And I think we've seen countless examples globally of sovereigns that hit first oil, but have already had governments that have sort of mortgaged the future forward several times over and 5 years forward. And the trickle-down effect is therefore very slow. That's not the case in Guyana, because the country hit first oil production, has started accruing monies in its sovereign wealth fund and investing in infrastructure, with just this absolutely sort of minimal, tiny debt to GDP quantum, which is kind of pretty fantastic. Next slide. There's a sort of brilliant piece of sovereign wealth fund architecture and documentation that's been in draft for some years. It's been really well sort of scrutinized and assembled with sort of external consultant support. I know a couple of the members of the board that are now overseeing the sovereign wealth fund. I think they're sort of, you know, wonderful people of extremely high sort of integrity and international standing, and again bodes really well for what the running of that sovereign wealth fund will look like. Next slide. And Guyana is also, you know, incredibly thoughtful and sensitive to low carbon development strategy and what responsibly developing oil in this day and age, as well as being aware of a green agenda, looks like. It sort of entertains me that variously in Costa Rica, Suriname, and Guyana, you'll see or hear various slides talking about the fact that depending on who you listen to and trust, there are either 2, 3, or 4 countries in the world that are currently net negative emitters on account of their low oil production and consumption and their incredible sort of well-protected natural endowment. Whether or not Guyana is currently a sort of slight net positive or a net negative emitter, I think is splitting hairs. Either way, they're a sort of extremely environmentally savvy country whose carbon industry, I think, represents many ways as big an opportunity for them as their oil and gas one. They did the first sort of sovereign jurisdictional carbon credit deal with Norway under the REDD+ framework in 2012, and are kind of really attuned to that. And I think exciting things will also come from the country in that space. Next slide, please. This is my final one. So you may ask, in the kind of light of that sort of glowing endorsement of a country, as I say, I'm an unashamed sort of Guyana file. I was down there last week. I'm in country fairly frequently. You know, am I putting my money where my mouth is? You bet. You know, Hannam Partners continues to sort of work for at least one Guyanese client a year, and quite careful in sort of our sequencing and conflict management. But we've raised a lot of money for a lot of businesses there now. I sit on the board of one of the oilfield service companies. I've bought into the local stock market, which has been a wonderful and lovely investment. And I've got sort of 2 companies I founded and that I'm materially involved in. It's a great place. I hope some of what I've said resonates with those of you who are active and working there. I hope it sort of piques the interest and curiosity of some of you who aren't there yet but are considering going. And you know, alongside Neil and the team, love to sort of talk through any Q&A that may arise from all that.
Thank you very much, Neil. That's very helpful. Okay, we have a number of questions, which perhaps we can rattle through reasonably quickly. There's one here from Paul Mathias, who says, are the political parties based on ethnic lines, with Afro-Guyanese tending to favour the opposition and Indo-Guyanese supporting the current government? Neil Marks, perhaps you can answer that?
The short answer is yes.
All right. Do you want to comment anything else on it?
It's just the way that Guyana has been structured, because I mentioned Forbes Burnham and Chedi Jagan. They were the original founders of one big PPP, but eventually they split, Burnham being black, Chedi being Indian, and so their parties came along post-independence, and so if you're PPP, you tend to be Indian, and if you are PNC, you tend to be black. That's just the way it has always been, and that has led to some of the ethnic conflicts that we have seen in Guyana, especially around elections time.
Okay, Daniel Parrott says, you talked about South and East Asian migration in the late 19th century. The ethnic Chinese community have a strong political and economic participation. The first president was from that group. Are there many links between the Chinese community in Guyana and mainland China?
Uh, In terms of political participation, I wouldn't say Arthur Chung became the first president of Guyana after independence, but his role was largely ceremonial and not necessarily deeply political. The Chinese have not been involved a great deal in Guyana's politics. Economically, their participation has been mainly restaurants and clothing shops, but increasingly a lot of them are involved in mining. So there's gold mining and bauxite. In terms of links to the Chinese government, the embassy in Guyana is heavily involved in seeking Chinese investors for Guyana. In fact, one of the largest infrastructure projects is being signed this morning, which is for a new bridge across the Demerara River. And that is a consortium of 3 Chinese companies.
Okay, Neil Passmore, I wonder if you can answer this. What about development plans? 5-year plans or whatever. What is there? How much? When? Where? Etc.
Look, I think at least to my mind and knowledge, the government is prioritising key enabling infrastructure. So there's some incredibly easy wins in terms of ring roads around Georgetown, bringing gas onshore, harbour bridges, trunk roads through to Brazil, that I think are exactly the kind of state level infrastructure that government ought to be prioritising and investing, because they sort of enable whole subsectors or multiple sectors and communities of businesses to follow in their wake. Beyond that, you've actually got sort of an incredibly easy playing field in terms of regulation, permitting, zoning, when it comes to just a lot of sort of business to business development and investment. So what I mean by that, Georgetown, like a lot of cities in the world, is clogged, desperately needs a kind of ring road that is going in, which will link the sort of artery inland to Brazil to the kind of coast road. If you want to buy kind of land either side of that road corridor and start doing stuff on it, land law's pretty simple. There's no zoning taking place in terms of residential or commercial. There's broadly speaking, there's a kind of let it happen government in terms of just trying to stimulate private sector activity. Ditto what will go on around the sort of former Wales sugar estate that's being turned into a sort of gas to power hub. The message is tons of excess power will be available. Come here if you want to sort of plant the flag and set up a business that could sort of benefit from that. So that's kind of necessarily quite high level. I think Neil touched on sort of priority industries in terms of agriculture because of the job creation and regional food security, in terms of tourism. There's going to be a whole raft of obvious consumer support stuff. Banking sector's sort of small but reasonably well developed. I think will be sort of harder getting into that. But yeah, sort of big sectors with a wide open door beyond all the obvious in oil and gas.
And I could add quickly, if you do want to read, the government has set out all of it in a document they call the Low Carbon Development Strategy. It's available online.
Okay. Savannah has asked, is there any concern that the next government could review and renegotiate contracts of the previous government? Mark, do you want to answer that?
Yeah, if I can answer that. To be fair, I mean, this is a bluff that governments make when they're in the opposition. The PPP had talked about this when they were in opposition, and but both sides have said that they respect the sanctity of contracts. And to be fair, I don't see the opposition coming to power anytime soon.
Neil, do you want to say anything about that in terms of renegotiating contracts?
No, look, I would sort of echo. I'd echo Neil's point. So I was down in February for the kind of oil and gas seminar. I think it was very sort of notable and deliberately sort of constructive tone set when the VP stood sort of shoulder to shoulder with Darren Woods from Exxon on stage, and both talked about what a wonderful, stable, long-term, predictable place Guyana was to invoke investment. Those were carefully and thoughtfully chosen words, as have been the license extensions of those who are exploring under sort of licenses awarded
Okay.
If I could just come in briefly on that point.
Yeah.
Guyana and the UK have signed some international treaties that specifically protect UK investors that are going into Guyana. It's obviously a very last resort. You don't want to have to use those protections. You don't want to have to bring arbitrations or bring disputes. But there does exist something for protection, which has got nothing to do with the Guyanese courts. It's fully neutral. It's fully independent. So if there are the types of political interferences that Neil and Neil say won't happen, there's always protection available for that for UK investors.
Okay, we were talking before about, before the seminar began, on border disputes, and there's a question here from Parker Keith, who says, can anyone comment on the dispute with Venezuela and the fact that Venezuela is claiming almost half of Guyana's current territory? What's the impact on oil investment and revenues in the future? I wonder if either of you, Neil Marks, can you comment on the status of that, and then anything else?
Yes, I can tell you what has happened. The controversy is before the International Court of Justice at the moment. It was referred to the court by the UN Secretary General. A quick background: in 1966, when we gained independence, is when Venezuela first raised this claim that the arbitral award of 1899, which settled the boundaries of the two countries, was null and void. And from 1966 way on to until a couple of years ago, it maintained this claim, and the Secretary General has tried what was called a good officer process, essentially a mediator, to try and trash this out. It hasn't worked, but he has the power to refer to the court, which he has done. Venezuela is not cooperating at the court, but that is not preventing the hearings at the court from going forward. So a very key hearing is coming up very soon. It has not affected oil investment and revenues, and I mean, I don't see it affecting it in the future. Guyana has been very strategic in its foreign affairs, building relations with Brazil and the United States. Exxon obviously being the operator of this giant oil block, and so it was kind of strategic in, I suppose, building a bulwark against Venezuela if it tries anything funny. It has tried stuff. I mean, gunboats have come in the initial periods just prior to when discovery was made, but it hasn't been aggressive of recent. And Guyana has said as much, that it's developing those strategic relations with the U.S. and Brazil to serve as sort of a protection.
Okay, that's fine. There's a question here from Paul on, is it correct that more Guyanese live outside the country, and does that have implications for the pool of potential senior positions in the government, in industry, and in social reforms?
I can answer that. I can say yes. That's the short answer. In New York, you probably have about 500,000 Guyanese. In the United States, in Toronto, you probably have another couple 100,000. Not so much here in the UK. I think we have about 50,000 thereabouts. And yes, it does limit the kind of pool of people that we have to take up leadership positions. There has always been talk of tapping the diaspora to fill some of these positions and so on, but it hasn't really got off the ground. Right now, that there are a number of foreign diplomatic posts, for example, to be filled, and the government has been thinking of tapping the diaspora for that, because I mean, we simply don't have the people in Guyana to fill all of those positions and to undertake the kind of change that you are talking about.
Okay, there are two questions here from Mike Singh on China again. Question for Neil Marks: tell us about Huawei, and also Chinese state companies are bringing huge piles of cash in, and the ability to push out traditional Western engineering firms from the US, UK, and Europe. I wonder if you can comment, Neil, on both of those.
Sorry, Neil, I don't know much about Huawei in Guyana. I know there was a big project a couple of years ago, but to be honest, it's not in my head at the moment. Whether I mean the question about the Chinese state owned companies pushing out Western companies, I don't think that will really happen. No.
Okay, fine. Neil Passmore, there's a question. Are there any needs for housing development?
Yes, absolutely loads. I think there are a number of sort of low housing schemes being sort of promoted, supported by the government. So for those who are developers on large scale, there is a need and land available, and ultimately the sort of combination of returning diaspora, oil and gas money for villas, and sort of wealth bubble in Georgetown is already pushing a lot of people out from the centre of the city into the sort of extremities or out of the sort of west bank of the Demerara. And I think at a more modest level, the opportunity for private investors to sort of buy single sites or several acre sites and put up a few residential units also exists.
Okay, there's a question here back on the low carbon development strategy update. That's dated 2013. Is there an updated version, i.e. post-oil discovery?
Yes, there is. There is the LCDS 2030. There is actually a website if you Google it. I think it's lcds.gov.gy. You can find the latest edition there.
And I think just to add, if you go back about 3 slides on the slide deck, you'll see an image of what the cover of that document and website should look like on my pages. I don't know if that's easy.
Everyone will get
one forward again. There you go. That's what you're looking for. That's the 2021, late 21, early 22 consultation paper. If you hit that, you got the right one.
Okay, that's great. Okay, we've got no more questions, but perhaps Neil Marks, is there anything else you'd like to say?
No, but I mean, in terms, I could add that in terms of people who are interested in investing in Guyana, like Neil has said, the government has been very responsive. For example, when the president was here in London recently, I had a chance talking with some of the investors and some of those who are part of the British Council who took down a delegation to Guyana, and they were amazed just about the accessibility to decision makers. The president, for example, gets things resolved very easily. You could be in his presence and he'll pick up the phone and call somebody to get an issue resolved or to get a question answered. And so the government is very bullish about investment and very facilitating of those who want to come in. If you have any other questions, I think Charles has my email and you can have it. And yeah. Neil
Passmore, any other final point?
I look forward to seeing you all in Georgetown. Please give Neil or I a shout if in the sort of wake of this we can sort of help you with anything or grab our details from the MENAS team. We'll be happy to help, and I hope we've been of interest and use to you all this afternoon.